Welcome back to the Wild West Vault. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe and like this video. It helps more folks discover these stories. And drop a comment telling us where in the world you're watching from. The vast, unforgiving sky stretched like a sheet of faded blue denim over the valley, a relentless sun bleaching the color from the land below. In the heart of this sprawling emptiness sat a ranch that seemed to be slowly giving up, sinking back into the dusty earth from which it had been carved. This was the home of Elias, a man whose spirit felt as weathered as the wooden sign that creaked over his gate, its letters, once proud, now too faded to read. The air was still and heavy, carrying not the buzz of industry but the profound silence of solitude, broken only by the listless lowing of a single cow and the tired sigh of the wind pushing through the loose shingles on the barn roof. Elias himself moved through this scene not as its master, but as another part of its gentle decay. His boots, scuffed and worn thin, kicked up little puffs of pale dust as he trudged from the corral to the well, his shoulders perpetually slumped under a weight that was invisible to the eye but crushing to the soul. His hands, calloused and etched with lines of dirt that would never truly wash away, told the story of endless, lonely labor. Every task, from mending a fence post that seemed to rot faster than he could replace it, to drawing water for his meager herd of cattle, was performed with the slow, deliberate rhythm of a man who was profoundly, utterly alone. The house, a simple structure of rough-hewn timber, stood as a monument to a happier past. Inside, a second chair at the rough wooden table always sat empty, a constant, aching reminder of the wife he had lost to a fever 2 winters prior. Her presence lingered in the neatly swept hearth, in the single, wildflower-patterned curtain that still hung in the window, a stark contrast to the bareness of everything else. Elias would sometimes pause in his work, his gaze drifting to the distant mountains, and in those quiet moments, the silence would press in on him from all sides. It was a silence that echoed in the empty rooms at night, a silence that was louder and more demanding than any noise. He wasn't just poor in coin. His pockets were indeed empty, but the deeper poverty was the absence of laughter, of shared worries, of another voice to break the immense quiet. He yearned not for riches, but for the sound of another person, for the simple comfort of knowing someone else was under the same roof, for the purpose that comes from providing for and protecting a family. The ranch was a body, and he was its lone, failing heart, struggling to pump life through a place that was becoming too big and too broken for one man to sustain. He fought against the creeping despair each day, rising with the sun to face the same endless list of chores, each one a battle against the entropy that sought to reclaim his land. It was a life of quiet desperation, a slow and weary march through each identical day, with only the ghosts of memory and the hope, as thin and fragile as a desert flower, that somehow something might change. The journey into town was a ritual Elias performed with a heavy sense of duty rather than any semblance of anticipation. The wagon, its wood groaning in a familiar chorus with the turn of its wheels, carved twin ruts through the dust of a road he could have traveled blindfolded. Buck, his old horse, plodded forward with a resigned endurance that mirrored his owner's, each step a measured beat in the slow, monotonous rhythm of their existence. The landscape unfurled around them, a magnificent and indifferent tapestry of tawny grasslands and distant, purple-hazed mesas, its beauty lost on a man who could only see it as a measure of his isolation, a painting he viewed alone. The sun climbed higher, a fierce, brilliant coin in the vast vault of the sky, and the heat began to shimmer in visible waves from the hard-baked earth, causing the distant town of Dusty Gulch to waver and dance like a mirage, a cluster of false promise on the horizon. Elias's thoughts were a closed loop, circling the grim arithmetic of his finances. The price of flour, the cost of nails, the worrying thinness of his last steer, and he barely registered the gradual transition from the open silence of the range to the outskirts of the town, where the first ramshackle structures stood like silent sentinels. Dusty Gulch announced itself first with sound, a low, gathering rumble that grew from a murmur to a cacophony as the wagon drew nearer. It was a raw, jarring noise against the profound, quiet Elias was accustomed to, a discordant symphony of shouting men, the tinny plink of an out-of-tune piano bleeding from a saloon, the sharp report of a blacksmith hammer, and the general chaotic din of commerce and conflict. The air, once carrying the clean scent of sage and dry earth, grew thick and complex, soured by the smell of unwashed bodies, cheap tobacco, horse manure, and the distinct, alkaline odor of dust stirred by countless boots. Elias guided Buck down the main street, a river of churned-up dirt bordered by wooden boardwalks teeming with life of every sort. Rough-looking miners with faces etched by sun and disappointment jostled against sharp-eyed businessmen in slightly less dusty suits. Ranch hands on leave hooped and fired their pistols into the air outside the saloons, their laughter abrasive and loud. Elias kept his eyes forward, his posture tense, a man navigating a dangerous current, wishing only to complete his errands and escape back to his silent, if lonely, sanctuary. It was as he passed the largest saloon, the Lucky Fortune, that the peculiar nature of the crowd gathered there struck him. It was larger than usual, denser, and thrumming with a different, more aggressive energy than the usual drunken revelry. Men were packed shoulder to shoulder, their faces turned toward the saloon's porch, their voices raised not in song, but in a harsh, competing chorus of shouts. Curiosity, a feeling he'd nearly forgotten, pricked at him. He reined Buck to a halt, squinting against the glare of the sun. He could just make out a figure standing on a sturdy crate. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like grinding gravel, his words unintelligible from this distance, but his gestures broad and theatrical. And then Elias saw them. 3 figures standing beside the man, slight and utterly still amidst the seething mass of humanity. Women. Their dresses, though travel-stained and simple, marked them as utterly out of place in this rough setting. One, the tallest, stood with a spine of iron, her fiery red hair a defiant banner under the brutal sun. But even from 20 yards away, Elias could see the tremor in her clenched hands, the wide-eyed fear she was trying so hard to mask with a mask of defiance. The second, a woman with soft brown hair that had come loose from its pins, had her face half hidden, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs she could no longer contain. The third was barely more than a girl, clinging to the second woman's arm, her young face pale with a terror so profound it seemed to have stolen her very breath, her bright eyes darting over the crowd of leering, shouting men like a trapped animal searching for an escape that wasn't there. A cold dread, sharper than any winter wind, pierced through Elias's weary solitude. This was no cattle auction. The truth of it landed in his gut like a stone. He was witnessing something monstrous, a transaction of human souls, and the casual cruelty of the scene froze him in his tracks, his own troubles suddenly shrinking into insignificance. A coldness that had nothing to do with the desert heat seized Elias, a frigid dread that started deep in his bones and spread outwards until his very fingers felt numb on the rough leather of the reins. The auctioneer's words, previously a muddled roar, now carved themselves with horrifying clarity into his consciousness. For a strong back and a pretty face. Do I hear $20? Who'll start the bidding for this fine, red-haired prospect? The man's voice was a vulgar instrument, each word a violation of the dignity of the woman who stood rigid beside him, her green eyes fixed on some distant point on the horizon, as if by refusing to look at the crowd, she could somehow remove herself from this nightmare. The responses from the men below were even worse, a chorus of coarse laughter and shouts that stripped these women of their humanity, reducing them to mere objects of utility or desire. "I'll give you 15 for the redhead. She looks like she's got spirit to break," yelled a miner with a grime-streaked face. "I'll take the weepy one for 10. She'll learn to smile," another hollered, his comment met with a round of raucous approval. The youngest, the girl, was shaking so violently Elias could see it from his wagon, a tremulous leaf in a cruel wind, her small hand gripping the older woman's sleeve as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly capsized. Time seemed to warp and slow. each second stretching into an eternity of witness shame. Elias saw the auctioneer's meaty hand clamp down on Maeve's arm, pulling her forward for inspection, and he saw the way her entire body flinched at the contact, a fresh wave of terror breaking through her defiant mask. He saw a large, rough-dressed rancher with a thick beard nod. His bid of $20 for Maeve met with a triumphant shout from the auctioneer. This was it. This was the point of no return. In mere moments, their fates would be sealed, their lives handed over to strangers who saw them as property, not people. A storm of conflict raged within Elias. The practical voice of a man who counted every penny, who knew the exact weight of his empty coin purse, screamed at him to look away, to cluck his tongue at the sorry state of things and move on. He had his own survival to worry about. His own ranch was a threadbare enterprise on the brink of failure. Intervening was madness. It was financial suicide. It was inviting a world of trouble he could not possibly handle. But then his eyes met those of the crying woman, Beth, for a fleeting second. It was a look of utter hopelessness, a silent surrender to a fate too awful to contemplate. And in that look, Elias saw not a stranger, but a reflection of his own profound loneliness, his own vulnerability in a harsh and often unforgiving world. He thought of his late wife, of the kindness that had been the core of her being, and he knew with a certainty that shook him to his core that she would not have driven past. She would have expected him to do something, anything, no matter the cost. The auctioneer raised his gavel, his mouth opening to finalize the bid. The moment for deliberation was over. A force greater than fear, greater than pragmatism, took hold of Elias. It was a raw, uncalculated act of compassion that bypassed all reason. He stood up in his wagon, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his voice, usually so soft and reserved, tore from his throat, raw and loud and desperate, cutting through the noise of the crowd. I bid all I have. The words hung in the air, absurd and monumental. He thrust his entire leather money pouch into the air, the meager contents within suddenly feeling like the weight of his entire future. A stunned silence fell over the crowd, followed not by respect, but by a wave of derisive laughter. The auctioneer squinted, his face a mask of amused contempt. "What's that, old man? You'll have to speak up. This ain't a charity." Elias, his face flushed with a mixture of terror and resolve, found his voice again. "It's everything. It's all I have. For all three." The laughter grew louder, more scornful. The bearded rancher who had bid on Maeve spat on the ground. "That pathetic sack wouldn't buy one of them, let alone all three. You're wasting our time." But the auctioneer, a man who understood the finality of a cash-in-hand offer versus the potential of a higher bid that might not materialize, quickly calculated the odds. This fool was offering immediate payment. He snatched the pouch from Elias's still outstretched hand, weighing it with a practiced jerk of his wrist. A nasty grin spread across his face. "Sold," he bellowed, the word a thunderclap. "To the broke rancher. They're all your problem now." And with that, he gave the three women a rough shove toward the wagon, turning his attention immediately back to the crowd, already moving on to the next source of entertainment. The transaction was over. Elias stood there, his body trembling, the reality of what he had just done crashing down upon him. He was now responsible for 3 lives, and he had just given away every last cent he possessed to do it. The silence that descended upon the wagon was a thick, suffocating blanket, woven from shock, terror, and a profound, disbelieving dread. It was a heavier load than any sack of grain Elias had ever hauled. The 3 women clambered into the back of the wagon with movements that were stiff and robotic, their eyes wide and unseeing, their bodies braced for an unknown horror. They huddled together on the rough wooden planks, a single trembling unit of shared despair, their gazes fixed on the man who now owned them, studying his every move as a condemned person might watch the approach of the executioner. Maeve's arm was wrapped protectively around Beth, whose quiet weeping had subsided into silent, shuddering tremors, while young Lily had buried her face completely in Beth's shoulder, as if by not seeing the world, she could make it disappear. Elias could feel the weight of their fear pressing down on him, a tangible force more burdensome than the physical emptiness of his coin purse. He knew words were cheap, especially now that he had none of the currency that usually gave them value, but he had to try to pierce the terrible silence. He turned on the wagon seat, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to startle them, and looked at the three pale, terrified faces. His own heart was still pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of his own fear and the staggering reality of his impulsive act. "My name is Elias," he began, his voice hoarse from the shout he had mustered in the saloon. But he forced it to be soft, to be calm, a gentle stream trying to erode a mountain of fear. "I have a ranch. It's a ways from here. It's not much to look at, truth be told. It's small, and it's seen better days." He paused, searching for the right words that were true and could maybe build a small bridge of trust. "You'll have your own rooms. You will be safe there. No harm will come to you under my roof. I give you my word." The words felt inadequate, tiny pebbles thrown into a deep, dark well. He saw no belief in their eyes, only a deep, wary suspicion, especially in Maeve's. His promise of safety likely sounded like just another kind of trap. Seeing Lily shiver violently, though the evening air was still warm, he acted on a simple, human impulse. He reached for his own worn bedroll, the blanket thin and patched but clean, and held it out to them. It was an offering, a silent language he hoped they might understand better than his words. "Here, for the chill," he said softly. Maeve hesitated, her eyes flicking from the blanket to his face, searching for the trick, the price attached to this small kindness. After a long moment, she reached out and took it, her movements quick and wary, pulling the ruffle around her own and Beth's shoulders, creating a small cocoon against the world. Elias turned back to the front of the wagon, clicked his tongue to set Buck in motion, and began the long, slow journey home. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon, the steady clop of Buck's hooves, and the vast, empty silence of the desert night closing in around them. The moon, a pale, sharp sliver, rose to cast a weak silver light over the landscape, transforming the familiar trail into a path of long, distorted shadows. Every bump in the road, every rustle of a night creature in the brush, seemed to make the women behind him flinch. Elias drove on, his mind a whirlwind of terrified calculation. What had he done? He had no food stored for 3 extra mouths. The winter supplies he had meant to buy were now an impossible dream. The roof still leaked. The fences were still broken. He had exchanged all his practical security for a monumental problem. Yet, every time a wave of panic threatened to drown him, he would recall the look on the auctioneer's face, the crude shouts of the men, and the absolute terror in the eyes of the young girl. He knew, with a certainty that went deeper than fear, that he could not have driven away and left them to that fate. His poverty had become their refuge, and that was a truth he would have to learn to live with. They arrived at the ranch gate just as the moon reached its highest point in the sky, the world bathed in a monochrome light that made the rundown property look even more lonely and desolate. "We're here," Elias said, his voice breaking the hours-long silence. He helped them down from the wagon, his touch light and impersonal, and led them to the small, dark house. He lit a single lamp, its warm, golden glow pushing back the shadows to reveal a main room that was Spartan but scrupulously clean, with a worn but sturdy table and 2 chairs. He showed them to 2 small bedrooms that had stood empty for years, their floors dusty, their windows bare. "These are for you," he said. "I'll be right outside if you need anything." He left them there, closing the door softly behind him, and walked back out into the cool night air, leaning against the porch post and staring up at the endless, starry sky, wondering what in the world he was going to do next, the immensity of his decision settling over him as heavily as the midnight darkness. The first pale light of dawn crept across the valley, a timid, gray fingers probing the darkness and gradually revealing the stark reality of Elias's ranch in its unforgiving detail. Inside the small house, the silence was not one of sleep, but of watchful, exhausted wakefulness. The three women had spent the night huddled together in one room, too frightened and uncertain to separate, listening to every creak of the old timber, every sigh of the wind, waiting for the door to open and for the true nature of their captivity to be revealed. Elias, for his part, had passed the night on the hard wooden floor of the main room, wrapped in his coat, granting them the privacy of the bedrooms and the illusion of security. Though he slept little, his mind churning with a low-grade panic over the monumental task that the new day would bring. When he rose, his body stiff and aching, he moved quietly, building a small fire in the hearth and putting a pot of coffee on a boil, its rich, bitter aroma beginning to seep through the small house. He could hear the faint, shuffling movements from behind the closed bedroom door, a sign that his guests were awake and listening. He prepared a simple breakfast of porridge, dividing the meager portions into 4 bowls, knowing it would do little to fill their bellies, but hoping it would serve as a gesture of peace. When the women finally emerged, they did so slowly, their movements cautious and their eyes darting around the room as if searching for hidden threats. They were still dressed in their travel-worn clothes, their faces pale and etched with the fatigue of a sleepless night spent braced for the worst. Elias gestured to the table. "Please," he said, his voice still rough with sleep. "It's not much, but it's warm." They ate in a silence that was thick and uncomfortable, the only sound the scrape of spoons against wooden bowls. Elias could feel their tension, their unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. He knew he had to address the monstrous elephant in the room, to shatter the terrible assumption that bound them in fear. He finished his meal and set his spoon down, folding his hands carefully on the table before him. He looked at each of them in turn, Maeve's defiant, guarded expression, at Beth's downcast, fearful eyes, at Lily's wide, curious gaze that held a glimmer of something other than terror. "I know what you must be thinking," he began, his voice low and earnest. "I know what you must be fearing. What happened yesterday in that saloon, it was a wrong thing, an evil thing. No person should ever be put on a block and sold like a head of cattle." He let the words hang there, allowing the truth of them to settle. I didn't bring you here to be wives or servants. I brought you here because I couldn't leave you to those men." He took a deep breath, the most important words still to come. "This is my home. It's poor, and it's struggling, as you can see, but it's a safe place. You are free to stay here for as long as you need to as my guests, to rest, to recover, and you are free to leave whenever you wish. There are no strings attached to my roof or my table. You owe me nothing." The effect of his speech was not immediate. Suspicion, especially Maeve's, was a fortress not easily dismantled. But he saw Beth's shoulders loosen just a fraction, a tiny release of the immense tension that had held her rigid. He saw Lily's head tilt, her bright eyes studying him with a dawning, cautious curiosity. Maeve was the last to react, her gaze searching his face for any hint of deception, any trace of the cruelty she had been expecting. Finding none, only a weary sincerity, she gave a single, slow nod, the smallest acknowledgement, though the walls around her remained firmly in place. The rest of the day unfolded in a strange, tentative dance. Elias, feeling the need to give them space, went outside to his chores. He was struggling to repair a broken section of the corral fence when he heard footsteps behind him. Maeve stood there, her arms crossed. "The post is rotten through at the base," she said, her voice flat, stating a fact. "You're just nailing a brace to kindling. It'll never hold." Before Elias could respond, she had walked to the woodpile, selected a sturdy new post and a hammer, and without another word, began to help him, her movements strong and efficient. Inside, Beth, seeking the comfort of familiar routine, had found the small pantry nearly bare. With a quiet sigh that was more determination than defeat, she took inventory of the few beans, the little flour, and the herbs growing wild near the porch, and began to plan a meal, her hands finally having something useful to do. Lily, drawn by the clucking of the chickens, ventured timidly into the yard and discovered the henhouse. Her small, quick hands were perfect for gently gathering the few eggs from beneath the irritated birds. A small, triumphant smile touching her lips for the first time since they'd arrived. It was not a sudden transformation into a happy family. It was fragile and quiet, and fraught with unspoken history and fear. But the absolute, paralyzing terror of the previous day had begun, ever so slowly, to recede, replaced by the simple, grounding necessity of work and the first, faint, and fragile threads of a trust that had not been earned by money, but offered through a profound and costly act of kindness. The fragile rhythm of their new existence settled over the ranch like a delicate, early morning frost, beautiful in its nascent form, but terrifyingly susceptible to the first true heat of adversity. Days bled into one another, each sunrise revealing a subtle shift in the dynamic within the small, weather-beaten house. The initial, paralyzing fear that had gripped the three women began to thaw, slowly replaced by a watchful curiosity and a tentative participation in the daily struggle to keep the ranch from collapsing under its own weight. Maeve's innate strength and practical knowledge found a natural outlet in the heavy outdoor work. She could heft a bale of hay or wrestle a stubborn post into the ground with a grunting determination that even Elias had to admire, her previous defiance channeling into a fierce, protective energy over the livestock and the land itself. Inside, Beth's quiet nature blossomed in the realm of hearth and home. She attacked the dusty, neglected kitchen with a quiet fervor, scrubbing surfaces until they gleamed, organizing the pathetic stores of food with a meticulous care that made their scarcity seem almost manageable, and filling the house with the comforting, earthy smell of baking flatbread and simmering beans. Little Lily, her spirit recovering with the resilience of youth, became a silent shadow to Elias, her bright eyes watching his every move, her small hands always ready to carry a tool, hold a nail, or simply offer a silent presence that he found, to his surprise, he deeply cherished. This fragile peace, however, was built on a foundation of shared, unspoken anxiety, a collective holding of breath. The sky for days had been a placid, endless blue, but the air began to change. It grew heavy and still, charged with a strange, waiting energy. The animals grew restless, the cattle lowing with a nervous edge, the chickens refusing to leave their coop. Elias, reading the ancient language of the land, felt a familiar dread coiling in his stomach. He pointed to the western horizon, where a line of clouds, bruised purple and impossibly tall, was beginning to mass and boil. "A big one's coming," he said, his voice grim. "We need to batten down." The afternoon was spent in a frantic rush of preparation, staking down anything loose, leading the nervous cattle into the relative shelter of the barn, checking the shutters on the house. The first gust of wind hit like a physical blow, a sudden, violent wall of air that screamed around the corners of the buildings, tearing dust and leaves into a blinding whirlwind. Then the rain came, not in drops, but in solid, horizontal sheets of water that hammered against the roof and turned the yard into a churning sea of mud within minutes. The world dissolved into a roaring chaos of wind and water. Elias and Maeve, shouting to be heard over the storm's fury, made a final dash to the barn to check on the terrified animals. The wind snatched the barn door from Elias's grip, slamming it against the wall with a sound like a gunshot. Inside, the cattle were panicked, their eyes rolling white in the flashes of lightning that illuminated the dusty interior. It was then, through the howl of the gale, that Elias heard it, a sharp, sickening crack from the old cottonwood tree that stood far too close to the chicken coop. He turned, his heart leaping into his throat, just in time to see a massive limb, heavy with water and rotten at its core, tear free from the trunk. It was falling directly toward the coop, and framed in the doorway, a small figure clutching a basket. Lily, who had braved the storm to ensure the chickens were safe. Time seemed to stop. There was no thought, only a primal, screaming instinct. Elias lunged, a desperate, off-balance dive that sent him crashing into the girl, shoving her out of the path of the falling timber with a force that sent them both sprawling into the mud. The limb landed with a ground-shaking crash, its outermost branches whipping across Elias's leg as it fell, pinning him to the ground with an agonizing, crushing weight. A white-hot pain, blinding in its intensity, shot through his leg. He cried out, the sound swallowed by the storm. Maeve was at his side in an instant, her face a mask of rain and terror. She grasped the main branch, her muscles straining against the immense, waterlogged weight, her boots slipping in the mud. It was too heavy. She couldn't lift it. "Beth!" she screamed, her voice raw. "I need you. Now!" Beth appeared in the doorway of the house, her face pale with fear, but she didn't hesitate. She splashed through the torrential rain, throwing her own slight weight onto the branch beside Maeve. Together, they heaved a combined effort of sheer desperation, and the massive limb shifted, just enough for Elias to gasp in a breath and drag his leg, now a throbbing mass of pain, free from its crushing prison. The three of them, Maeve and Beth panting and soaked, Elias clutching his leg in agony, and a sobbing, terrified Lily, half-dragged, half-carried each other back into the house, leaving the storm to rage impotently outside. That night, huddled around the fireplace, the wind howling its defeat around their secure walls, they tended to Elias's leg with torn strips of cloth and water heated over the fire. The crisis had passed, but in its wake, it had forged something new in the wreckage of the storm. They were no longer a man and the three women he had saved. They were a unit, a family. They had faced the abyss together, and they had not let each other fall. The walls of fear and suspicion had been washed away, not by gentle words, but by the violent, clarifying flood of shared peril and mutual protection. The weeks that followed the great storm were a time of slow, deliberate, and shared healing. The violent weather had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling under the sun, but also littered with the evidence of its fury. Shattered branches, flooded gullies, and a barn roof that now leaked with a renewed determination. Elias's leg, though not broken, was a tapestry of deep, painful bruising that forced him to move with a slow, hobbling gait, a constant reminder of his desperate lunge into the path of the falling limb. This physical limitation, which would have once spelled certain disaster for the solitary rancher, became instead the catalyst for the final dissolution of the invisible barriers that had separated them. With Elias confined mostly to the porch, directing operations from his chair like a general with a busted leg, the running of the ranch fell to the three women, and they shouldered the burden not as obligation, but as a shared purpose. Maeve became the undisputed master of the outdoors, her innate strength and fierce competence coming to the fore. She single-handedly hauled away the wreckage of the fallen tree, chopped it into neat stacks of firewood for the coming winter, and with careful instruction from Elias, managed the repairs to the barn roof, her movements on the steep pitch sure and confident. She seemed to draw strength from the physical labor, her previous defensiveness melting away into a calm, capable authority. Inside the house, Beth's domain flourished. Her gentle hands not only mended Elias's clothes and kept the house in spotless order, but she also, with a quiet magic Elias could only marvel at, transformed their meager supplies into meals that were both nourishing and surprisingly delicious. She had discovered a patch of wild tomatoes and herbs near the creek, and her careful nurturing turned them into a small, productive garden. The air was now perpetually filled with the comforting aromas of baking bread and simmering stew, a stark and wonderful contrast to the lonely silence of mealtimes past. And Lily, her youthful energy boundless, became the connective tissue of the ranch, acting as a runner between Maeve outside and Beth inside, helping Elias with the small tasks he could manage from his seat, and filling the yard with the simple, joyful sound of her laughter, a sound that, more than any repaired fence or stocked pantry, signaled the true transformation of the place. One evening, as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, they all gathered on the porch. The last of the repairs were finished. The fences stood straight and true, the barn was secure, the garden was thriving, and the house, though still small and simple, radiated a warmth and contentment it had not known in years. They sat in a comfortable silence, watching the light fade over the land they had all worked so hard to save. It was Maeve who finally broke the quiet, her voice softer than Elias had ever heard it. She turned to him, her gaze clear and direct, no longer shadowed by fear or suspicion. "Elias," she began, and the use of his name held a new weight, a deep respect. "That day in Dusty Gulch, we believed our lives were over. We expected to be owned, to be used, to become shadows of ourselves. You saved us with a kindness that asked for nothing in return. You gave us a choice when we had none. You offered safety when the world offered only danger." She paused, looking at Beth and Lily, who both nodded, their eyes glistening in the twilight. "You didn't buy us with that money. You bought our chance, a chance to remember who we were. This," she said, gesturing to the peaceful ranch, the tidy yard, the comfortable silence between them all. "This is who we are now. This is our home. If the offer still stands, we'd like to stay. Not as your guests, but as your family." Elias looked at the three faces illuminated by the dying sun. Maeve's strong and resolute, Beth's kind and gentle, Lily's bright and hopeful. The lonely man who had driven into Dusty Gulch that day was gone. In his place was a man whose heart was so full he thought it might burst. He had started with nothing but an empty purse and a heart full of grief. He had given away all his money, and in return, he had gained everything. He had learned that the greatest treasures, the only ones that truly lasted, were not mined from the earth or won in a poker game. They were built day by day with love, with respect, and with selfless kindness. They had all been lost, each in their own way, but together, by choosing each other, they had found their way to a truth far richer than any gold strike. They had found a true home, and they had found each other.